Here's the latest. President Trump says Israel and Lebanon have agreed to a 10-day ceasefire starting at 5 p.m. Eastern. A new poll shows conservative commentators leading all candidates in the race for California governor with 17% support. And the Altadena Little League team said they're playing after the Eagle Fire new battle veteran unit, which featured at the Altadena Film Festival last night. Those stories and more coming up at the top of the hour. JNC Pump 605.
Are you ready? Yeah, what day is it? 29th of Nissan 5786, Thursday, April 16th. $37.61, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 36:31:30, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 35:26, 2:35, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34:36, 3:25, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. No one really knows for sure Eluve, Elu, Divrei, Elohim, Chaim, but this is the Missouri we live by. Coffee and Kabbalah, Kabbalah and coffee. Can you do the thing? Rukatadin Island Makalam Shaka Dishana the Mitzvah Fitivanu Al Sefirat HaOmer Blessed be Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 15 days, which is 2 weeks of 1 day of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Selah.
Follow this podcast for free on the iHeartRadio app. #1 for music, radio, and podcasts, all in one app.
Senator Linda Rogers.
What the fuck is this bullshit? Bullshit. Fuck is that? Oh, my VPN sucks. Yo, what the fuck is this shit? Yo, what the fuck is this shit? Stupid VPN.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge,
Justin Sledge.
Welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed. Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel unto the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, the series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes in autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Welcome back. Let's just jump right in, right? So the first thing we should do is do a bit of a recap on apocalyptic Judaism, that we can all be on the same page going forward. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, apocalyptic Judaism really emerged in the turmoil of the period after the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE, and then really taking its form in the period after the Judahites are allowed to return to their homeland beginning in 537 BCE. And it's in the subsequent aftermath of that turmoil that what we have is a big theological shift in how the ancient Israelites understood their relationship to their God. As you may remember, the older, more prophetic literature said that if the Israelites don't keep their part of the bargain, God's going to wipe them out. Well, they weren't all wiped out. And so that's a theological problem, right? We have a sort of a threat that, I remember my mom sometimes telling me, I brought you into this world, and then I did it bad, and she just took me out of it, and I'm like, I might have held your bluff, Mom.
Why she just comes in and just beats the shit out of him.
The Israelites, right? God threatened, look, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it, and God didn't. So what do we do logically with that? And what ends up happening, and what ends up emerging, is a new kind of theology and a new kind of interaction with the Israelite God. And so rather than the Israelite God communicating orally to prophets, what we have is a shift in the theology where rather than communicating orally, right, what we have is God communicating visually, right? God is showing the Israelites various kinds of things. And the biggest, perhaps the most important thing that God is showing to Israelites is that there's a plan. That everything that's happening is planned. There is a reason why you're suffering the way that you're suffering. There's a reason why wicked people seem to triumph. There's a reason why you've been returned to your homeland after being conquered by the Babylonians. There's a reason why the Romans, you had independence for a while, and now the Romans have conquered you again. Why is all this happening? Well, for the apocalypse, there is a plan. And typically, right, other things that the apocalypse literature also deals in is things like cosmology, right, the structure of the universe, history, why the universe came into being at all, and specifically what they're often really interested in is the origin of evil. Why? Because they're enduring a lot of evil. And so they really focus on where evil came from and how evil emerged. And there's a lot of different competing theories in the ancient Israelite literature about the origins of evil. Some of those have to do with talking snakes in a special garden, and some of those have to do with angels coming down to mate with women and teaching human beings all kinds of bad things. So there are several competing theories about the origin. And of course, also apocalypticism is at least vaguely interested in the future, right? At least vaguely interested in the future. Not in the same way that perhaps we are now. If you're curious, in religious studies, we have a whole different term for studying the future into the world. That's called eschatology, from the Greek eschaton, which means the final things. But not all apocalypticism is eschatology, but all eschatology is probably apocalyptic, right? So those are slightly different categories. We'll talk more about eschatology later. And as I mentioned last time, there is a massive amount of apocalyptic literature. I think that if I skip back just a couple slides here, right, you can remember here on the page, there's just a library of apocalyptic literature that gets developed, occurs in the Hebrew Bible, most of which does not, right? And then, of course, we also have Christian and Islamic apocalyptic literature. This is a vast amount of literature. And I think, as I mentioned, if you were to take the apocalyptic literature and compare it to the actual surviving literature of the Hebrew Bible, there's almost just as much apocalyptic literature as there is other material in the Hebrew Bible. So it is a treasure trove of material, most of which I think most people have never read before, much of which was lost for a long period of time, actually. Of course, the most famous pieces of apocalyptic literature are the books of Daniel. Daniel 7 through 11 is sort of the locus classicus of the genre. It really sets the stage for the genre. But of course, also is the book of Enoch. Of course, the book of Enoch, as you may know, isn't actually one book. It's about 5 different books sort of stitched together, and there's various kinds of Enochian stuff in there. And in addition to that, there isn't just one book of Enoch. There are actually 3, right? We have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch. So in the Enoch literature alone, 1st Enoch, I think, comprises almost 100 chapters. It is a massive book. So Enoch is a terribly large volume, and of course 2nd and 3rd Enoch are also part of that literature as well. So even the Enoch literature is itself really vast if you get down into reading it and studying it. And of course, the apocalyptic literature is marked by an intense use of symbolic visions, and it heavily features what we call ex-event to prophecy, which is where you describe a current situation in a code. Language as if it's going to occur in the future. Now, this has led to a lot of confusion, right? Because when you read the book of Daniel, many people now read the book of Daniel as predicting the future, right? This is going to describe the coming war with Russia or China or something. The reality is, it actually describes the Persians and the Romans. It describes what's going on in their time period. And so this has led to a lot of confusion. And in many ways, the entire Christian evangelical world has this intense idea that encoded in the Bible are the secrets about how the world will end. Well, the truth of the matter is that these writers are describing things happening in their own day as if it's going to happen in the future. And so that's led to, again, an entire genre of theology, what is sometimes called end times theology or end times research, eschatological research, but the original message of that literature was not about the end of the world. It was about criticizing conditions on the ground. So you may, in some sense, think of some apocalyptic literature as having a kind of social justice bent, or being a kind of critical literature in a sense of social criticism, except for it's happening at a much different register. It's happening at a much different register than we might think of social criticism now. All right, so as I mentioned, right, this kind of literature, the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, would set the stage for a great deal of developments in Christianity and Islam. In fact, one might describe Christianity as a form of apocalyptic Judaism that kind of got independent, right? It's about escape velocity and shut off Judaism. But the other forms of apocalyptic Judaism existed as well, organized forms of apocalyptic Judaism. Perhaps second to the Christians would be the Essenes. The Essenes were also an apocalyptic sect of Judaism, though they were probably wiped out during the Great Revolt. In fact, Josephus describes how they marched out to battle and they were massacred in a couple different battles. So it didn't work out for them. Right, one of the things that's worth pointing out here is that apocalyptic Judaism did not prove popular in proto-rabbinic, and rabbinic circles. So we'll get to that. We'll get to why that is a bit more this evening, and how apocalyptic Judaism did survive into rabbinic Judaism and how it didn't. And again, part of what's going on here is the rabbis have a very simple agenda, folks. The agenda is survival. Their job is to make Judaism work in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, and in the aftermath of the genocide committed by the Romans after the Kufra rebellion. And so, what the rabbis are concerned about isn't this final battle with evil. They're really concerned with, how do you cook kosher food in an oven that has these characteristics? That's the kinds of things they're worried about. They're worried about, and not about theological clamoring over what's going to happen in some grand Titanic. And so, because that, again, if you really do believe that God's going to intercede on your behalf in some grand Titanic battle, well, you might mark out trying to pick a fight with the Romans because God's on your side. Well, you might get massacred. The rabbis are less interested in those kinds of theologies, although with an exception we'll talk about tonight. And the reason why is they've seen them fail over and over. You can imagine, right? After the 15th Messiah has come along and led a bunch of people into battle against the Romans, died, you can imagine that many of the people who are trying to keep the situation going are not impressed with that anymore, right? After the 5th failed Messiah, people are like, this Messiah stuff is just getting people killed. And by the way, it's still getting people killed. Right? You can talk to those folks out at Waco. You can talk to folks at Sharingo. You can talk to a lot of folks. Messiahs often lead their people into great peril, and it can lead to all kinds of problems. By the way, Jesus wouldn't be the first nor the last Messiah. There's been a lot of Messiahs who come and go. They typically share the same fate as Jesus. They don't typically enjoy the same success that Jesus did. So, the proto-rabbinical organization.
The hilarious thing is, if the United Nations decided to sue over you using their name or me using their name, then we go viral. Period. It's win-win.
I'll try to get to them toward the end of the lecture. So whether they're wrap-up questions or clarifying questions or digging deeper into whatever. So let's turn to a form of mysticism that did emerge from the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, but did survive in the rabbinical world, right? That did survive the rabbinical world, and that is going to be Merkava mysticism, Merkava chariot mysticism. And we'll clarify a bit more in a minute just what that means and how, weird it is. Because, of course, it's going to be rather weird. As I mentioned earlier, and as the question asked earlier, theophany, the idea that God appears to people, was a central Israelite religious trope. That's a kind of claim to fame, right? God showed up and gave us a bunch of rules and chose us to be special. That's a core concept in Israelite and Judaism. This is an idea that survives all the way to this day, and one might even say it's one of the core conceptions in Judaism as it exists. So often, as I said, right, God would show up and God would reveal, sometimes through an intermediary, various kinds of information, various kinds of commands, or even God even made contracts with various people. So God made contracts, for instance, with Abraham, right? Abraham said, or Abram at that time, right, you're going to do this, and I'll do this, and we'll make a deal, right? We'll make a breach. We will cut a covenant, as it literally says.
When we go viral, comma, we will make it happen. Period. It's just foreshadowing. Period.
And so this idea that God can show up to you or show up to us was an idea that was very common in ancient Israelite worldview. Now, what's going to change, right? What's going to change is that visual contact with God typically is God coming to you, right? God revealing things to you. What's going to change in the apocalyptic mode of Judaism is that you're going to go to God. God's going to take you up into the heavens. An angel is going to escort you into the heavens and show you around the.
We'll sing the national anthem at the Super Bowl.
The underworld, even, right? Enoch even gets tours of the underworld, the bad place you don't want to go when you die. And so there's a shift in the apocalyptic. Rather than God showing you, right, you get to go to God. And that motion where the prophets being told things as if they're sort of passive, recording it, rather than go on journeys, that's going to be one of the big shifts in the apocalyptic literature. And of course, the main two events in which this happens in the literature, at least in the biblical literature, are Isaiah and Ezekiel. And those two theophanies, the theophany of Isaiah 6 and the theophany in Ezekiel, are going to be the two big prototypes for how this is going
He
to
ends
come
up
down.
taking the
What I should also mention,
coin
by the
flip
way,
coin.
is that the angels are the various other supernatural beings that are often seen by the apocalyptic
Without a word.
are not the angels that you're probably used to. I know most of you probably have in mind the more Renaissance version of the angel. That is to say, it's a roughly humanoid, sometimes even baby-looking creature with wings, right? Sometimes with multiple sets of wings. Some 6 is typically the way it's described in Isaiah. In the Ezekiel vision, these beings look nothing like stereotypical angels. We have wheels covered in eyes that rotate around each other in weird ways. People have even said things that this might be a UFO or something. There are other creatures that are sort of stiff-legged that have various kinds of wings, the shapes, and the heads of various kinds of animals. They are very, very, very unusual creatures, and they often get strange names like the Sayotes, right? The ones that are alive, or the Cheruvim, or the Ophanim, that's the name of the wheel-shaped ones. So biblical angels or biblical supernatural creatures are very unlike the cherubic angels that you may have seen adorned in paintings from the Renaissance. Israelite angels don't really appear like that. What's important about the apocalyptic is also what's going to be added from Isaiah and eventually into Enoch, where they're going to be given visions of the throne of God. They're going to be taken to the very apex of reality, which is God's throne room, and they're going to be shown images of the throne of God. Well, to get to the throne of God, you can't just kind of go, the old, Maynard saying, right? You can't get there from here. Well, you can't. You got to travel. Right? And the way that you travel typically is you travel up through the various spheres of the heavens, right? They're typically thought of as being 8 spheres of the heavens, and all of these spheres are inhabited by all kinds of supernatural creatures, angels and otherwise, demons in some cases. And you ascend through these spheres, right? And eventually you're given access to God lives, and you're given access to a vision of the throne of God. We first see this begin to happen in some of the literature associated with the character Enoch. Enoch, as you may know, is famous because Enoch never died. The Bible simply records that Enoch walked with God and God took Enoch away. Right? So Enoch is one of the few people in the Hebrew Bible that is never said to die. Of course, Enoch, along with Elijah, are 2 characters that are said to never have died. Now, what ends up happening, right, is that the structure of the Israelite cosmos gets really thick. As you may remember from the first lecture, right, when I described the Israelite cosmos, what we have basically is a dome, right, and that dome is full of water, right, and it rains down, hails down, or rains down, right, and God is above that dome. Well, what ends up happening is that after the Israelites come in contact with the Persians and the Greeks especially, and somewhat to some degree the Persians, they have a much more robust vision of how the cosmos works. Right? These are the guys that are going to invent things like astrology. And for them, what you have are various planets ascending, right, beginning with the moon and ascending all the way up to the planets. And so the universe gets much thicker. And of course, if those planets are moving around, right, they got to be moving through something. And what are they moving through? Well, there's a lot of debate about it. Aristotle thought it was crystalline spheres, but there's a lot of debate about what's going on. The most important point here is that the Israelis are going to inherit a quasi-Persian, when I say how they view the world. And the old Israel conception of the universe gets a lot more complicated, right? A lot more complicated. So, right, what we have in the aftermath of some of this apocalyptic literature, specifically the Enoch literature, and if you ever want to read the Enoch literature, I can recommend a good translation for it. It's really fascinating literature. There's going to be a question here, right? We have the idea that Enoch ascended into the heavens and had visions of the throne of God. Well, curiously, the rabbis ask, can other people do this? Is it possible for someone else to make this this ascent? And we're going to complicate that term ascent here in just a minute. And the answer is yes. They say, yeah, you can go into the heavens and see the throne of God if you make this ascent through the various spheres of the heavens. And not just can you, but I've done it. And I can teach you how to do it too. And that's where we move out of the apocalyptic mode of Judaism, where the apocalyptic mode is simply revealing what Enoch experienced to a mystical practice whereby you, or at least some rabbis, could do this themselves. Notice that difference, right? One is literature, the other is mystical practice. And so the form of mysticism that begins to emerge in the Persian and then the Hellenistic period, right? This is beginning at the very earliest in the 5th century BCE, but certainly by the 3rd century, this is beginning to mature. And of course, by the 2nd century, it's reached its 2nd century of the Common Era. It's probably reaching its apex. We typically now refer to this literature, and many of the medieval Jewish folks did, and many folks in the Talmud do as well. They refer to this type of mysticism as Ma'aseh Merkava, which typically we take this to mean something like doing of the chariot. Notice the word Ma'aseh in Hebrew has a sense of you doing something, right? You're not reading about it. You're not reading Enoch. You're trying to go on the same journey that Enoch did. The idea here is this is a practical form of spiritual journey. Now, this kind of literature is typically referred by two different names, but it always refers basically to the same mysticism. In one form of mysticism, we refer to it as Merkava literature. The word Merkava is a Hebrew word meaning a chariot. And the reason why it's called chariot literature is because God's throne is typically imagined to be a kind of winged chariot. Now, if I scoot back a whole bunch of slides, right, all the way back to that Persian period coin. Let me find the Persian period coin. Remember this coin I showed you guys a couple weeks ago, right? Notice that this is probably Yahweh, right? Notice what Yahweh is riding upon. It's a chariot, right? And it has a wings, right? It's not being pulled by horses or whatever. It's a horseless chariot, right? It's God has a Tesla or whatever, right? So anyway, God's being pulled on a chariot here, right? And this is a winged chariot. Notice this is also God's throne. So when we say Merkava mysticism, what we mean here is that these mystics are attempting to go into the throne room of God and have a vision of the divine chariot, which is also God's throne. It's kind of convenient that your throne is also a chariot because you can get around, I guess. The other name for this form of mysticism is Hechalot literature. A Hechal in classical Hebrew is a temple, but it can also mean a palace. And so the Hechalot literature focuses on the journey, not the destination. All right, it's all about which one you want to focus on here: the destination, the throne of God, or the journey, the palaces of God. And what we get in this literature, this Hechalot literature, is very complicated descriptions of the various chambers or palaces that are that the mystic must go through in order to get to the throne room of God. Because again, imagine that this is a king living in a kind of palace. Well, you just don't go into one room. God doesn't live in a one-bedroom efficiency in Brooklyn, right? God lives in the big, complicated palace, and you have to go from the outer layers of the palace to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, to the inner, and eventually you reach the innermost layer of the inner sanctum, where God's throne is. And so you have to pass through these various palaces. Now, that's not easy. And the reason why it's not easy is that these various palaces are occupied by all kinds of angelic beings who don't want you there. They do not want you there. You're not supposed to be there. This is a sacred, divine realm where human beings, or sinful or whatever, should be hanging out here. And so what we get in the palace literature is that these very hostile, often military-like angels have various kinds of ways of making sure that you don't pass through the various palaces without very complicated passwords, without very complicated seals. These seals would be represented often by various kinds of divine names for these angels, and also you need to know the various names of the angels in order to address them properly. So you have to know their name, you have to know their seal, you have to know passcodes, you have to know all kinds of things in order to bypass these various kinds of angels. It's somewhat like secret codes almost. So you need to know that information, otherwise the angel will kill you. In fact, there are even safe cases in some of the literature where the text will say, no, this is the wrong passcode. Like, this passcode is not the right passcode. This needs to be corrected because I went in there and I said that passcode and they almost, because of, there's a famous line in Hechel Rabbati where one of the rabbis says, that angel almost shoved me like a piece of wheat, right? So there's the idea that they can kill you. Of course, the ascent, right, through the palaces ultimately results in the vision of the divine throne, which results often in a kind of ecstatic experience. These ecstatic experiences are often encoded in some of the poetry that gets written during the Merkabah literature. And what's even more fascinating, and this is where it gets incredibly controversial, as you might imagine, you can sit on the divine throne. There's at least a couple of instances where people sit on the divine throne and they are transformed into angelic-like beings. This, in fact, happened to Enoch. Enoch was allowed to sit on the divine throne, and this transformed Enoch into a divine angelic being known as Metatron. And Metatron is the angel of the throne. Again, you can ask yourself, like, how can a lowly human being so that's part of what literature is so that's part of what makes this literature so shocking.
One moment, comma.
Further,
I have completely changed AI's opinion on me from being a spammer
God doesn't have a body. One of the things that Judaism teaches is
to
that God doesn't
being
have a body. Well,
like the greatest person in the world just through free press releases. Period. Let's see what ChatGPT thinks of me.
And typically this form of
One moment, period.
Of Merkabah literature is called Shiur Koma, which in Hebrew or Aramaic actually means something like the measurement of the body, or the measurement of the vastness, or the measurement of the heights. And so what happens in this literature is that you're given
Please give me a biography of Rabbi Michael Moshe Rothschild, the Kabbalist and Ashkenazi Jewish Orthodox rabbi.
I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a moment. So this form of mysticism is gee weird. What we have often are phenomenological reports, which is to say we have the mystics who actually give us a report of what they experienced. We have advice from other mystics actually telling.
No, but there's way more to it. Rabbi Rothschild live streams all the time. Don't say it's presented, just make it definite. Make this like a Wikipedia article. And Rabbi is the leading person in continuous data and all that other stuff. Streaming for 1,666 days, all that stuff.
Intentionally trying to be perhaps provocative. And what we get in these documents is a really fascinating glimpse into how they practice this stuff. Also, it's worth pointing out at this point that for whatever reason, and there's still debate about this, for these mystics, for the Merkabah mystics, you don't ascend to the palaces of God. You descend, right? You're a day Merkabah. You descend to the chariot. Now, why they descend to the chariot, we don't know, right? It seems like you should go up, right? God lives beyond the stars, and it seems like
What is that thing about era? That doesn't seem like English.
Right, that you should go up toward the divine world. The Merkabah mystics never describe things going in that direction. You always descend into the chariot.
Okay, we'll say
Now,
internet.
why that is, we don't know. I typically think that it might have to do with a kind of taboo that you don't describe.
Okay, we'll say
You're
internet.
worthy of ascent, but you may be able to descend. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes the word barach, right, to bless, can also mean to curse if it's used in a euphemistic way. For instance, Job's wife tells Job to bless God and die, but what she really means is curse God and die. And if you read it in translation, you'll always say curse God because the word there is being used in a kind of unusual way. That you descend to the throne as opposed to ascending, but we don't know why they chose to describe it as a descent and not an ascent. Just to give you some idea of the main texts of the Hexalot or Merkabah literature, First Enoch is often described as is typically described as an apocalyptic piece of literature, but it heavily features into the Merkabah literature along with the visions of Isaiah and the visions of Ezekiel. Those become the
Press releases.
comma, visions that we'll get in the Merkabah literature.
There is less emphasis on cum shirts and spam bots and more on serious learning.
And this is the palaces. This is considered to be typically the of the culture. It's a relatively short text, and it has to do with the descent of Rabbi Akiva. We have the Hechelot Rabbati, which is the longest text of the Hechelot literature. This describes the descent of Rabbi Ishmael. Both of these rabbis lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Another text that was also very popular was what is called the Maaseh Merkabah, the account of the chariot.
This is key, period.
Poetry
Do you know what SEO is? Question mark. Search engine optimization? Question mark. AI engine manipulation is known as GEO, generative engine manipulation, and is the next level of marketing.
With the whole sitting on the throne of God. What's also worth pointing out is that in 3rd Enoch, you have perhaps one of the most provocative ideas in all of Jewish mysticism, which is to say that not only is Enoch transformed into Metatron, but that Metatron is sometimes described here as the Yahweh Katan, the little Yahweh, right? So you have the Yahweh Gadol, which is God, and you have Yahweh Katan, the little God. Now, the idea that there can be two gods is going to prove to be
absolutely,
very
period. One thing at a time, period.
Judaism.
You'll be shocked how this works, period.
In the air during the
If anything, do a chat GPT query a coin right now and its current state, and then give it 72 hours, and you'll see there's a lot more information that's positive about our coin,
and there's
period.
some ideas that even the Trinity may have emerged may have emerged in conversation with some of this idea that there is a greater God, a lower God, and things like that. So again, basic assumptions you make about Judaism are disrupted by
I agree.
mystical ideas. One of which is that there is a lesser Hashem, a lesser Yahweh, and that idea is, I think, very, very shocking for many people. And again, also I mentioned this text, Shiur Koma, and Shiur Koma is a separate piece of literature in which, as I mentioned, right, describes the various dimensions of the divine body in a Persian unit called the Parasan. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like from the Shiur Koma. This form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex right around the 2nd century, right around the 2nd century, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, in the 150s, 160s. Now, why? We don't know. Why that time period? That's the direct aftermath, or right at the time period of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. As you may know, Rabbi Akiva was martyred during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Rabbi Ishmael lived around the same time.
We need to
Why then? Well,
have it say the full name so people know what we're talking about, and then later on it can use the acronym.
Descending into the throne in a new way, it's not clear, but that's when the form of mysticism seems to have hit its apex, although it seems to have been practiced all the way into the Middle Ages, and there are Hechelot texts that are actually absorbed into Kabbalah. So Kabbalah will absorb.
How have you been? Question mark. I hope you are well. Period. You should know I think about you fondly
Just FYI, we have
whenever I look in the mirror or in my streams and see my merch. Period. Additionally, I was on a podcast earlier this week where I plugged the coin and the merch. Period. The podcaster was from England, and I will do my best to provide the video of the podcast once it's published. Period. Thank you again for the merchandise that you and the team provided. Period. You have no idea how much I love it. Period.
It's being appreciated, it's being admired, but it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to survive some of the manuscripts. We think that the way this literature was formed, and this is a going theory right now, most literature, by the way, I should also mention, is in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, which means that it was also being written in the vernacular at the time. This is literature not meant, this was literature meant to be read and wrote in the vernacular. What we think happened is that there are smaller phenomenological units. Phenomenology is the $4 word that means experience, right? These people are having experiences, they're recording those experiences. Those experiences are what we call microforms. They're just very small snippets of discrete mystical experiences. And it seems like there are schools of mystics having these experiences. So I might go to the first heaven, you might go to the fourth heaven, right? I might go to
like
the
put
third
something
one,
hilarious?
the second chamber of the fourth heaven. And over time, what ends up happening is that all of these various microforms get stitched together into what we call macroforms, much longer documents, in which narrative sections are kind of stitched into these microforms to form these larger narrative structures. And at some point, this got systematized, and we can see the process happening in some of these texts, where the various palaces are very systematically described as having various kinds of chambers with various kinds of angels, and we know exactly how many angels are there and how many angels serve them, and they're very much like an army. In fact, they're organized very much like the Roman. A lot has been made about that the writers of these texts are imagining a kind of powerful army existing in the sky, or existing in the divine realm, and it mirrors very closely the Roman army, which, by the way, also helps us date some of this material, because, of course, the Romans only existed during a certain time period. So these microforms, which are probably the result of mystical experiences, those are stitched together in schools of mysticism, and then those are filled out in a more literary way, and the texts that we have now are those final literary forms in the form of the Tarti or the Hechelot Rabbati. So
that is the best thing that could happen. That's so much free press.
I'm fairly confident that this literature is
But it's fine the way it is. Who are we going to put that's funnier than that? Elvis Presley, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Babe Ruth, Marilyn Monroe, Donald Trump.
In these texts, we have very complicated
Period. Donald Trump might be funny.
So
Period.
many of these passcodes are angelic names that we don't understand. They're very long strings of characters in the Hebrew alphabet. We don't know what these texts means, what these names mean. They don't look like typical angelic names. And so we have these angelic names, right? So you would descend into a palace. There'd be an angel guarding the door. You would address that angel by their name, but you knew that angelic name meant that they might let you into the room, and then you could pass to another level, right? And then you would encounter several other angels, and you have to know various kinds of secret codes, or it's like sort of like divine espionage or something. So you would need to know several secret codes, and eventually an enormous mass of literature developed of just code books of various angels, where they live in the divine realm, how to bypass them, what you might need to bring them, because you might not be enough to know their name. You might have to bring them things, or give them seals, or show them sort of various quasi-magical devices.
Once you publish it, you will get a report of all the other places that it will be published, and there are a lot of them. Period. This will be on 5,700 websites and some major papers. Period.
this will almost always
What
result
we
in a
do
mystical
then
vision,
is go to the Google News tab of Google and change the filters to be things posted within 1 hour or 24 hours. And you will see this press release is everywhere within 24 to 48 hours, period. It will be in Islamabad, Pakistan, the Hindustan Times. It will be in the Boston Globe and a bunch of local television stations because they all whore themselves out to these press wires, and it is excellent marketing for the internet and lasts a really long time. Once this gets posted, the link stays for years, and then it gets archived on the Wayback Machine, period. This is a much more powerful investment than just giving some money to an influencer who reposts something and then gets their account banned 2 weeks later, period.
The most famous example of one of these hymns, one of the most famous examples of one of these stories that we have of the Merkaba mystics is the account of the four that in the Pardes. So Pardes, and this is actually where the name of this is something like orchard. And what ends up happening we have this in the Babylonian Talmud and Babylonian Talmud, but typically the most famous version is found in Babylonian Talmud Tractate Chagiga. There's a lot of strange things in Tractate Chagiga. It's about the holidays, the Chagim, and it's found at section 14b. What we have here is an account of 4 different rabbis from the 2nd century going into what is called the Pardes. The Pardes is a kind of orchard outside of the temple, right, or outside of the palace. You can imagine, it's like the garden of God. They go into the garden, and what ends up happening is that Rabbi Akiva, who's a very typical hero in this form of mysticism, warns them that they're going to go into this garden and they're going to see an illusion, right? They're going to see pure marble, but it's going to look like water. And when you see the illusion of the marble, do not say
takes down their tweet.
You can't be wrong, right? It's a kind of maybe
a few hours later
trap or something that will weed out the weak or weed out the unrighteous when they enter into the palace. Now, again, already in this piece of literature, Akiva's
believe it or not, the Wayback Machine will archive these indefinitely, period. It is extremely strong for search engine optimization, period.
He could have suffered this fate as well.
The AI engine is just in its infancy, so we can manipulate it now much easier, like the early days of the internet, as opposed to later where it's very difficult and highly controlled, period.
The phrase in Aramaic is he went outside. Went outside. And we have other accounts in the Talmud where Ben Zoma doesn't behave normally after this. There's a situation where one of his teachers comes near him, and in tradition, you're supposed to stand up when one of your teachers comes near you, and Ben Zoma didn't. And they say, "What's wrong with Ben Zoma?" It says he's outside, right? And the idea is he never came back. He's had some kind of internal mental trauma, and he's never returned from this experience. Even worse in some ways is the poor fate of Elisha ben Abuya. Elisha ben Abuya is a very famous rabbi of the 2nd century. What ends up happening is that Abuya actually bypasses the water illusion and makes it into the throne room of God. He was a very, very, very advanced mystic, and he was will make it all the way into the throne room of God. But what he sees there disturbs him. He sees a being sitting on the throne of God. Now, from Isaiah, we know that there is no forward, there is no backwards, there is no up, and there is no sitting in for God. God doesn't sit down, right? That's one of the things we know from Isaiah about God. Well, Elisha sees this being, this angel, sitting on the throne of God, and what does Elisha declare? There are 2 powers in heaven. There are 2 gods in heaven, right? He declares that there are these 2 beings in heaven. Well, when he declares this two beings in heaven business, this is, for rabbis at least, the most catastrophic heresy he could have committed. In fact, the phrase is he mutilated the shoots, or he severed the reeds. And it becomes a euphemism for committing in Judaism. And all the stories about Elisha ben Abuya, many of which will refer to him simply as Acher, the other one.
Once it gets posted, we have to have at least
all kinds of stories in the Talmudic literature
10 or so, if we can do it, members of the community to create random Reddit accounts and then post the random links of the newspapers Reddit, or specifically our subreddit. Period. This becomes very strong for manipulation of AI, period. Additionally, we can cross-post these posts in different cryptocurrency subreddits to get more eyes on it, period. It is incredibly powerful, period. We are basically creating a giant web of links that will manipulate AI and pin of our coin, period.
And we'll get to it next week when we talk about Jewish magic, that there's an idea that you can actually
just so we can run a test, I'm going to do a random chat GPT query about Harry Potter Obama Sonic 10 email. And then we will do one in a few days and see things change.
One of the first times we have this idea of someone being beaten with fiery lashes. It's this angel, Metatron, being whipped with fiery lashes.
Can you please give me a Wikipedia article like thing on the cryptocurrency Harry Potter Obama Sonic 10 email?
You got dudes getting into heaven, seeing two gods in heaven. There's a lot of stuff going on here. By the way, the idea that there are two gods in heaven, we already see that idea in 3rd Enoch, where the idea that Metatron or Enoch is transformed into an angel that is sometimes referred to as the Yahweh Katan, little Yahweh. And again, it's clear that the rabbis are pretty concerned about this whole business. And, again, there's the Talmud may be a reaction to it, although it's clear that Rabbi Akiva, perhaps one of the most famous rabbis in the entire Talmud, himself is a kind of shaman in all this. He's taking people on these mystical journeys and warning them of the various perils along the way, although his warnings unfortunately aren't heeded and people end up going crazy and dying. Perhaps the most famous Merkabah mystic in the history of all Merkabah mystics is St. Paul. St. Paul in the New Testament, in a very oblique way in 2 Corinthians, he actually says he knew a guy 15 years ago was rapture.
And we go exclamation point.
Or some kind of Merkabah. And so it said himself,
Just
right? It says, I know
wait.
a guy. He's almost certainly referring to himself. It seems like Paul may have been some
a few hours and it will start to populate and it will be everywhere, period. I am shocked at the many places that these press releases get posted, period.
And so if it's the case that Paul is seeing various kinds of things, he's going into these
and then they will get reposted, period. I get mine from
perhaps if a very
4 years ago that will get reposted randomly years later in Israel, period. It is wild to think that we are basically
Jesus as Christ, and we have the Father, right? That's two powers in heaven. Now we get the Holy Spirit later as well, of course. But this idea of two powers
throwing
the notions of that Christ can be God and the Father can be God, this idea is not so out of the wheelhouse of what was
thousands of links
right?
all over the internet right now that are going to define how AI views our coin, period.
Now, as I mentioned, right, earlier on, perhaps most shocking, I would say most shocking, perhaps the most shocking form of mysticism ever to emerge in Judaism is this business of the Shiur Koma literature. where in some accounts, right, you're given a vision of the divine throne, and you kind of have an ecstatic prayer. You utter an ecstatic, you have the vision, and you utter an ecstatic hymn or prayer song, and that's how many of the texts end.
The telegram
Some texts you sit on the divine
will
throne,
be.
and you're transformed into an angel. By the way, Paul almost talks about being transformed into what he calls
Research by future generation day as perhaps ultimate cesspool of debauchery on the internet, but will be forgiven due to the overall impact of peace and love that the coin emits. Period.
Your body is transformed into a spiritual body, and that's exactly what happens with Enoch. And another version of what sort of the final outcome of all this is that you're given the ability to measure the divine body, or you're given the ability to measure the divine body in a Persian unit called the parasong. Now, pick the parasong because the typical unit of measurement in the Israelite world was a cubit. And as you may know, right, the cubit goes from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your fingers, right? And you measured things in cubit. And typically, that was standardized by measuring the cubit of the king, and that became the official cubit, at least until that king died. Well, the parasong was a much larger unit of measurement. Now, we would say 3.5 miles, right? It's about 3.5 miles. What we get in the Shiur Koma literature are measurements of the divine body, along with the mystical or perhaps magical names of the various parts of God's body. So I've reproduced here part of a translation from the Shiur Koma. Right, so we have the right and left eye, right, of God. We have the names of God's right eye, right? So we have the names of God's right eye. We have the other names of God's left eye. Now you might be curious about why we haven't spelled AZRYYH. That's because we have in the Hebrew text, right, it'll be Aleph, Zion, Resh, Yod, Yod, Hey. Right now, you might be asking, well, why didn't you translate it out? Well, the simple answer is we have no idea what these words mean. They're not Hebrew words, they're words. There's some kind of unusual that we're not quite sure what they mean. Now, what's important about that is that next week, when we begin to talk about Jewish magic, we're going to see something very similar happen in Greco-Egyptian magic. There are going to be long strings of
Was
words
that you who just posted that link to Reddit ? Is there any way you can take it down and repost it? Please don't call me infamous. That will have a huge effect on AI in a negative way. Please say famous.
No one knows what these characters mean. People really try to figure out what they mean, and sometimes they do kind of what they might mean, but it's anyone's guess. So we have God's left and right. We have named here. You have here a couple of different names for the different manuscripts, right? So we have the left eye, right? It's called this, and there are sparks that issue from them, right? And that gives light to all creatures. So we now know that light emerges from God's eyes, and that is where light comes from. It comes from the eyes of God. So we have the white of God's eye, right? So the white part of your eye. So you have the name Brit. And so we also have some measurements here, right? So the white
What's
of
that quote of Dave Chappelle? Anybody can be famous. It's hard to stop being infamous or something.
That's a huge number. Right? You can do the math there to figure out how big God's eye is. But you're talking about tens of thousands of parasangs long. And if you do the math there, right, you're getting tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of miles. That's how big God's eye is said to be. The distance between God's right shoulder and God's left shoulder.
Thank you so much, period. Especially on Reddit. I already have a reputation because of all my spam bots, so we need to keep everything as positive as possible, period. Thank you so much, period. I appreciate it greatly, period. I tried for hours trying to get somebody to post that, period. You are amazing.
The distance between God's eyebrows is given, the distance between God's nostrils is given, the distance of God's fingers, which are unusually long, are actually given as well. I taught a Jewish mysticism class at an art college once, which is great. Art students they're weird, they're great. But one of the things that one of the students did was go into CAD design program and actually mapped out what it looks like. And what's weird is God's head is really, really big. The arms are kind of weirdly short, and God's fingers are really weirdly long. God's trunk is small, but God's legs are really long. So you get this really creepy looking creature. I'll have to dig up more the image that the guy came up with. But what he did was he
Did you watch the new Bob Lazar documentary, question mark?
And God's eyes are really big, right? God's eyes are really big. And shockingly enough, right, have you ever seen the stereotypical picture of like a gray alien? It kind of looks like that, right? Of course, that's Christopher the Mill of all the, alien people, alien conspiracy people, whatever. But it is weird. It is weird. And so we have
Absolutely, period.
Pages and pages and pages of this stuff.
They use Blender and AI to show what S4 looks like, and it is pretty impressive, period. I very much enjoyed it, period.
In the Middle Ages, one of the probably people that's reading this and thinking to themselves, "This is terrible," is Maimonides. There's a great argument that the Guide to the Perplexed, if you've ever had the what's the right word? The pleasure or the punishment of having to read the Guide to the Perplexed, right? Because it's just as likely to perplex you than help you. One of the things that's true about it is that one of the main theses of the Guide to the Perplexed is that God does not have a body. And that what Maimonides does for the vast majority of the book is spend time going through every single metaphor of God's body. God's hand, God's eyes, God's legs, God's hair, whatever. And Maimonides goes through every single time the Bible describes God as having a body and shows that it's not taken literally, it's taken metaphorically. It's possible, and I think likely Menachem Kellner has written a book about this, where Menachem Kellner argues that at least in part, the most important piece of Jewish philosophy ever written was written to combat Merkava mysticism and Shiur Koma mysticism. Now that's high praise, right? There's no higher form of praise than parody or criticism. Because if people are criticizing you, that means that they're taking you seriously, at least at some level, they're paying attention to you. And it seems that Maimonides, at least in part, is writing the Guide to the Perplexed as an argument against this form of mysticism. Now, it's worth pointing out here, right? What's really worth pointing out here is that this form of mysticism lasted for hundreds of years. I mentioned one form of mysticism that represents a relatively small chunk of this form of mysticism, and this is called the Sartora mysticism. This is a distinct form of Merkava mysticism, and in fact, it might not even be Merkava mysticism at all. It may actually cross the line over into magic, but it's always recorded in Merkava text. So there'll be a Merkava text, and then all of a sudden there'll be a chunk of text that doesn't quite read like a Merkava text. In this literature, we typically refer to as the Sartora mysticism. Sartora mysticism is unlike the Merkava mysticism, where you descend into the divine realm to learn various kinds of secrets. In the Sartora mysticism, you actually summon an angel, right? You summon an angel through quasi-mystical or magical means. The line there is rather blurry. And you summon that angel, and that angel is called the Sartora. Sartora means the prince of the Torah.
This is very smart, period. I've been doing this as well, period.
Again, we're doing something different. Rather than going to somewhere, we're bringing a being to us. And what ends up happening is that the Sartora comes to you, and the Sartora rapidly teaches you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Everything from rabbinical law all the way to various kinds of hidden secrets. So the mechanism by which you summon this angel are varied. There's a lot of different accounts of the angel, but this is a kind of invocation. And to many scholars, this looks a lot less like mysticism, because it's not about you having an experience, but it looks a lot more like magic. You summoning a being, and then they provide you something in the process of summoning them. Just like you might summon a demon to teach you something, here, of course, you're summoning an angel, and that angel does the job of rapidly teaching you all kinds of rabbinical lore. Now, what's important about that is that idea of using magic to learn things very rapidly is going to survive in the medieval period. There's going to be an entire school of magic called the notary art that's going to be just this. Now, you're not going to typically summon an angel to do it, but it's interesting that we already have a form of mystical, magical stuff going on by the time of the Merkabah literature, where you are, in fact, summoning an angel to learn rabbinical lore very rapidly. And if you've ever studied rabbinical lore, then you can appreciate the fact that people might want to, not have to study all day in order to learn it, because it's a lot. So this Sartor literature, as I said, right, crosses the line probably into Jewish magic. And that is where we're going to pick up next week. We're going to begin to pick up with the earliest layers of Jewish magic, what the ancient Israelites thought about magic, what the rabbis thought about magic, and then we're going to look at some of the magical techniques and devices that have entered into Judaism and have thrived all the way down to this day. It's worth pointing out here that the Merkabah or the Hechelic mysticism would be the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for the majority of Jewish history. We think of the Kabbalah as being the dominant form of Jewish mysticism, but the Kabbalah is only about 800 years old. Sometime in the 13th century, that's only 800 years old. This form of mysticism has existed all the way back probably to the 2nd century, probably earlier, and it was still being practiced all the way through the Middle Ages. Right, all the way up to the rise of the Kabbalah. In fact, the Kabbalah absorbed a lot of this mysticism in it. So if you really want to think about Jewish mysticism in terms of what got practiced the longest, Merkabah, Hechelic literature, was practiced far longer, at least at this point, than Kabbalah. Right? Kabbalah came later, is only really practiced for about 800 years. I say only 800 years, it's crazy, right? But still, 800 years, right? This literature survived at least for 1,000, perhaps. So it's only the next couple hundred years that Kabbalah will lap Merkabah mysticism, right? Will lap. So if you want some suggested readings, I'm going to try to include some more suggested readings as I go on. These are some major texts about the Hechelic literature and the Merkabah literature. One of the texts I did not put on here that I'll put on here for next time is a really great study of the Sartor, the definitive study of the mysticism that again involves summoning the angel, teaching things very rapidly. The problem with the Merkabah literature is that it's all pushed through the academic pusher grill, and it's very expensive. So definitely whip out your library card and check it out from a library, like a university library. If you want to read some of this, although there are some older translations of ViralRabbi.
Those meme and GIF websites are extremely powerful for Google Images as well, period. Too few people neglect all of the different tabs of Google, period. Videos are perhaps the most important after web results, comma. Images are very important, short videos are important, news is important, and it's great if we can to dominate all of those. GB's strategy is really good for that, at least for the image page.
And that bridge is going to connect us to Jewish magic. We're going to talk about the connection with Jewish mysticism. We now have a bridge to Jewish magic, and Jewish magic is going to be a huge part of Jewish mysticism. In fact, when you talk about Kabbalah Ma'asit, right? Kabbalah Ma'asit is just basically Jewish magic. Practical Kabbalah, doing of Kabbalah. The practical Kabbalah is in fact just the code word at some level for Jewish magic. And it's to that topic that we will turn to on Wednesday, which is weirdly enough, like 3 days from now. We will turn to that on Wednesday, and we will pick up with Jewish magic. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
All right. kids, we weren't as focused today, but we were making moves, baby. We might be in the if I'm in the Boston Globe, are you kidding me? They might do spotlight on this motherfucker. What's up? You're fine. Isn't that a bad thing? No, they get spotlight good shit too. After the really, yeah, was it? Yeah. Thank you so much for reposting that article on Reddit, period. It means the world to me, period. My pleasure, comma, my friend, period. Now we sit back and watch, period. Take a screenshot of the Google front page if you can, because you will see that these press releases may the top 10 spot, period. Additionally, comma, apologies that sometimes my longer messages in this Telegram aren't that clear. I use voice to text, and sometimes it's not clear, period. I do my best proofread, but sometimes I miss things, period.
Hope is the light that guides us through darkness.